I want to talk tonight about the soldiers that fought in the Revolutionary War and how they were treated in their own time, how they were seen in their own time. And I think it's a subject that has certain contemporary relevance because we're involved in a couple of wars now, or have been in the last few years, and we have plenty of veterans that are having issues. And the soldiers of the Revolution were the first veterans in American history. One of the things that surprised me in doing research about the war, and where I got the subtitle, "The Amateur Soldiers Who Won America's Independence," was that they were amateurs, that they, Henry Knox, who was a bookseller in Boston, and Mad Anthony Wayne was a farmer and tanner in Pennsylvania. Daniel Morgan was a hillbilly teamster from Virginia, and Nathaniel Greene was a businessman from Rhode Island, for whom Greene County is named. But another surprising thing that I found doing the research was that the way in which the soldiers were regarded and treated before and after the Revolutionary War, it's not something I discovered or are revealing new. It's been in the historical record all along, but it's not usually emphasized. And I asked myself, how would you expect that the soldiers would be treated? They fought for 8 years. They persisted through a lot of hardships, and they defeated the most powerful military machine in the world at the time, and they won the war. So it seemed logical they would have a big celebration at the end of the war. Most of the troops in 1783, when the war was winding down, were down here in New Windsor, near Newburgh, and in West Point area. And General von Steuben, or Steuben as it's called in English, had been in the Prussian army. He was very good at mounting these great celebrations when they were celebrating the entry of the French into the war. He organized an affair where they would take thousands of men lined up in a circle, and then they would each fire their musket off one after another like a drum roll, and it would go all the way around the circle and then go all the way around again, and it was great spectacle, great huge noise, and then they would go home, and Johnny Comes Marching Home. They would be have parades and be honored in their hometowns, and maybe given a piece of land to farm, and none of that happened. The celebration for the demobilization of the Continental Army was called off. And I'm going to quote tonight a couple of times from Joseph Plum Martin, who was a young man. He was 15 years old in 1776 as the war was getting going. He enlisted, and he spent the entire war in the ranks, and he got up to be the rank of sergeant. And years later, he wrote a very insightful, very humorous memoir and gave his view of what had happened during the war. And he said about the end of the war, he said, "To discharge us absolutely in our present pitiful, forlorn condition, it was feared might cause some difficulties." In other words, the government was afraid of the army. And the reason was that they had not been paid, they had not been given the supplies that they had been promised. All the promises that the government had made to them had been broken, and they were angry. And the government was afraid that if they let them out en masse, that they would pillage the countryside or who knows what. So what they did instead was to march, in some cases, they marched troops to their home states and then put them under furlough, on furlough, so that everybody knew the war was over, everybody knew the army was being disbanded, but technically they were still in the army, so they could be disciplined, they could be court-martialed if they caused trouble. Other troops were like the Delaware and Maryland regiments, who were one of the crack regiments in the Revolution, had been fighting down in the South, and they were just told, go home. They had absolutely nothing. They had no money, ragged uniforms, and they had to walk home from down in South Carolina. And some of them had to beg on their way home just to get traveling money so they get home. When they got home, there was no parades, there was no honor given to them. The government had decided to give them a gift of a musket. Each guy got a musket, which was the musket he'd been carrying for 8 years in the war, which the government, of course, then didn't need anymore. So that was the gift that they got. Most of them sold their muskets quite quickly for traveling money. They got certificates for the pay they were owed, their back pay. The government was very generous with certificates. And most of them sold those certificates as well for pennies on the dollar to get enough money to get home. What most people mention to me when I talk about the veterans of the Revolution, they say, oh, didn't they get land? They were given land, weren't they? They were promised 100 acres of land, either in their home state or in an adjacent state. And they were given certificates, again, for land that was out in Ohio or Pennsylvania. Now, the frontier was New York. So if you got out to western Pennsylvania or Ohio or Indiana, that was a remote area. They didn't know how to get out there. They didn't know where the land was. There was no provisions made. So land speculators would then descend on them and say, well, wouldn't you like to sell that certificate? And they amassed certificates from the veterans. So the question then is why? Why was this situation to develop? And I think to understand it, we have to turn back to the beginning of the war, 1775. There had been a long buildup of tensions from the Stamp Act of 1765 until the war actually broke out in 75. But it had not been planned. It was spontaneous. Neither side thought, well, in April of 1775, we're going to go to war, we're going to attack, it just broke out spontaneously at the violence that occurred at Lexington and Concord. When that happened, the British were ready. They had an army, they had a navy, they had systems of supply, they had boards of war, they had a bureaucracy, they had an officer corps, and the Americans had none of that. They were essentially had to put together a supply system, which was unsystematic, very ill-managed. They had to supply the army over roads because the British controlled the sea. They couldn't ship supplies up and down the coast. They lacked resources. The government had very little resources. There was no manufacturing in the country, so as far as cloth or guns or anything you might need for the army, it was not easily accessible. The currency that the Continental Congress issued was valuable at first, but as the war went on, it became less and less and less valuable until it became essentially funny money. And they had competition from the British in supplying the troops because a lot of whether they're loyalists or whether they're just sitting on the fence, they would rather sell their goods, their farm goods, their whatever supplies they had to the British, who paid in the coin of the realm, rather than sell it to the Patriots. There was corruption, which was inevitable. There was, Congress had no authority to tax, so they depended on the states. There was a lot of confusion. Who was going to pay for the troops? The states had raised these troops, provide them for the Continental Army, but who was going to pay for them? Who was going to pay their pay? That was always very confused, and the states, of course, had gone to war over no taxation without representation. So they also then decided they didn't like taxation with representation either. So there was always short of money. And all this culminated famously in the winter at Valley Forge in 1778. The troops marching through the snow, barefoot, leaving their blood on snow. It's not a myth or a cliche. It was just a real thing. When they got to Valley Forge in December, they had to build log cabins. They said, well, here's your camp, a forest, and some fields. They had to go into the forest, chop down the logs, put the logs, notch them, put them together, put up cabins, and then live in those cabins all winter, burning green wood. Of course, there's no seasoned firewood like so available today. A lot of times they didn't have food. They would go for days without food at Valley Forge. They would mix up flour and water and pour it on hot rocks to make these little thin cakes that they would eat. If they got sick, which many of them did, they were told to go to the hospital. The hospital was a barn, drafty barn. And when they got there, no blankets. We don't have any blankets. And so they had to lie down in the straw, if there was straw, and whatever clothes that they had. Many of them were literally naked, because their clothes, if you can imagine, during the fighting and marching, if you were marching along and there was a bramble patch in front of you, you couldn't say, well, I'm not going to march that way, I'm going to go around. You had to march straight through it, and their clothes would get torn to tatters. So George Washington became alarmed at Valley Forge, and he wrote a very angry letter to Congress, and he said the army is going to starve, dissolve, or disperse if you don't do something. And they were very close to that happening. Washington had started out with a certain contempt for his soldiers. He was an aristocrat from Virginia. He got to Boston to take over the militia groups that had originally started the war, and he didn't like the way the troops smelled. He didn't like the way they talked. He thought there were something very stupid about these people, these New Englanders. By the time they got through the first couple of years of war, and he was at Valley Forge, he said, "I feel for them super abundantly." A lot of the problem in the Valley Forge winter was a breakdown in the supply system, which Washington then turned to Nathaniel Greene, and one of Greene's great contributions to the war was to take over as quartermaster general and patch together a system to bring supplies in. Something as simple as making sure there were bridges between you and, over the streams between you and where you want to get the supplies sent from. He had a head for that type of logistics and did a very good job, and it was one of his great contributions to the war. So these were the practical reasons for the treatment of the common soldiers during the war, and it went on throughout the whole war. In the winter of 1780, it was one of the coldest winters that anybody could remember. You could walk from New York to Staten Island. New York Harbor was completely frozen over. General DeKalb said the ink froze in his pen while he was sitting by the fire writing. And Joseph Plum Martin was in New Jersey at that time, where the army was wintering over in New Jersey, and he went for 4 days during that winter without food, except he said, I did gnaw on a birch twig, got some bark off of that. They continued to have problems of paying the troops. When Washington in 1781, the culmination of the war, was leading the whole army down to capture Cornwallis at Yorktown, they got to Philadelphia, and the troops said, we're not going any farther without getting paid. Then they hadn't been paid for months and years, some of them. So Washington had to go to General Rochambeau, who was the commander of the French army that was accompanying them, borrow money on his own account and give the troops coins, which was the actual specie that they were looking for, not the continental dollars, which were, by that point, were almost entirely worthless, in order to induce them to go any farther. But beyond all these practical reasons, there was an attitude that people had towards the troops that developed over the course of the war. When the war started, it was mostly, or entirely, militia troops that encircled the British Army in Boston. And the militia were real citizen soldiers. They were intended to fight locally. They were intended for temporary duty to defend their homes. And it was a long tradition under the British and the Americans. They were a cross-section of the population, the farmers, craftsmen. They were very enthusiastic. They were very patriotic. And for that first year of the war, that spirit and that formation of the Army held true. Everybody thought the war was going to be only a few months. As so many wars, we start, it's going to be short. And they had farms, they had families, they had businesses. And so when the war continued on and went into 1776, their enthusiasm began to flag. At that point, the Army started to transition into a professional army under Washington and the officers they appointed. And they tried to get men to sign up for several years so that they could depend on them, so once they got, they wouldn't be running home to take care of their farm. With that transition, more and more of the soldiers were ne'er-do-wells, younger men, drifters, unattached, unemployed. At times, vagrants would be arrested and pressed into the Army. They were forced into the Army. Some of them signed up because they were patriotic. Some of them signed up because they wanted that bonus. They gave them a signing bonus, $20 or $50. And they were desperate for money. So another factor was that they allowed wealthier people to hire substitutes. That was also true, of course, in the Civil War. But they could send indentured servants. They could send their own slaves to take their place in the Army. As these type of people began to appear in the Army, the regulars, as they were called, or the Continental Army, began to be seen as hirelings, as mercenaries, low-class people, what they called the vulgar herd. And Congress had less and less incentive to pay them or to supply them or to worry about them. And if they suffered, well, the poor always suffered. That was too bad. But these were just poor people that are out there in the Army. So the soldiers look around and they see that people around them have cash, they have luxury, a lot of them are making money on the war. And they see citizens who despise them for their poverty. As early as 1777, Daniel Morgan, who was a very astute backwoodsman and had lived poor for most of his early part of his life, he said that the war should not end until the soldiery are provided out of the estates made by it. That is, the people who had made money off the war. And of such as had too much property to their share. In other words, the soldiers should be paid by those who had the money to pay them. Now that's a sentiment that's not welcome much in this country anymore, but I guess we don't think of anybody having too much. So these two factors, the practical difficulties in supplying the Army and the attitudes that people had to them that resulted in the privations and the suffering and the lack of pay, had a result, and the result was mutiny. And when we think about mutiny in the Army, you have to remember it's kind of a tricky thing to keep a group of armed men under control. All they have to do is to all get together and say, well, let's not follow orders. What are you going to do? You have no control over them. And so the way that it was done was to make any idea of mutiny punishable with very severe punishments. If you hinted at mutiny, if you had something bad to say about your officers, you would be severely punished, and if you engaged in mutiny, you would be hanged. So that was a serious business. When we talk about mutinies in the Continental Army, it was no joke. They'd started as early as 1779. There were a few small mutinies, some more in 1780. In the winter of 1780, that very bad cold winter, near Morristown, the Connecticut troops talked of mutiny, and they were very disgruntled, and they had to send officers down to talk them down, essentially, and prevent the mutiny from occurring. And Joseph Plum Martin, who was in that group of soldiers, said, "We sat around venting our spleen at our country and government, then at our officers, then at ourselves, for our imbecility in staying there and starving in detail for an ungrateful people who did not care what became of us." On January 1st, in the next winter, January 1st of 1781, after a very bad year for the Patriots, the officers in the Pennsylvania line, with the state troops that were supplied to the Continental Army, the regulars, were called the line of that state. They were on the front line. So there was the Pennsylvania line, the New York line, the Connecticut line. And the officers of the Pennsylvania line, again, camped down in New Jersey, were having a small, modest celebration New Year's Day. They heard a noise. They went out to see what was going on, and the troops had come out of their huts and their tents with their guns in their hands. And this was unheard of. And the officers, ordered them back. They didn't follow the orders. The officers jumped on their horses, tried to restore order. One of the officers was shot dead. Others were pulled down from their horses and beaten. The mutineers took over the artillery and began firing over the heads of the officers, and it was a full-scale mutiny. 1,500 men turned and mutinied. And there were a couple of causes for it. One was that when the Pennsylvania had signed up these troops, they had said they were signing up for 3 years or the duration of the war. But they didn't make it clear whether that meant a minimum of 3 years, but longer if the war went on longer, or did it mean a maximum of 3 years, or if the war was over before 3 years, they would get out. It was worded in a way you could interpret it either way. Well, the troops interpreted it one way, and the government interpreted it another way. And the other beef that they had was they kept seeing these guys knew that they'd been fighting for years themselves, and these new recruits were coming into camp with a bonus of like $200. Well, of course, that was partly the depreciation of the currency, and it was partly the difficulty the government was having with recruiting anybody. But the guys who had been in there for 3 years had only gotten a bonus of $20, so they didn't think that was fair. So they marched out of camp, and they were badly needed troops, experienced troops, and the big fear was that they would go over to the British. And the British were jubilant about this. They sent out feelers to try to lure these guys in to join the British Army. You get better food, better pay, better uniforms. And they said, no, we're not deserting. We're not going over to the enemy. We just want what we're owed. And we're going down to Philadelphia and get it. And that's where Congress was sitting. So they marched down there with guns, artillery, and they were going to confront Congress. They were met in Princeton by the authorities from Pennsylvania, and they began negotiations, which the government really had to do. They couldn't afford to lose troops in that masses of troops like that. And they came to an agreement. Some would be paid a bonus for re-enlisting, and some would be allowed to go home. The mutiny settled down. They went back to camp. 2 weeks later, the New Jersey line got the same idea. Well, we'll make our own demands. They started marching towards Princeton. Again, there were some negotiations. They got what they thought that they wanted. They returned to their camp. But George Washington, who was up here in Newburgh, realized this was now spreading through the army, he sent loyal troops down to New Jersey. The New Jersey line, troops from the New Jersey line who had mutinied, woke up and they were surrounded. And they were given 2 minutes to come out of their cabins without their guns. And they came out, 12 of them were picked out who had participated, 3 ringleaders, and there was no trial or anything. They said, we're giving these 12 guys muskets. They said, well, you're going to kill these 3 guys here that were the ringleader. And they blew the heads off of 2 of them, and then the 3rd guy was pardoned. So that was sort of put a damper on the mutinies. But that spring, Anthony Wayne, who was the general of the Pennsylvania line, was ordered to take his men down to Virginia, and they were going to campaign against Cornwallis in Virginia. And these were the same men who had mutinied, and they said, no, we're not going. And Anthony Wayne was very sympathetic to his troops. He was very concerned about their welfare, and he said, you're going. And he picked out 12 guys, and he said, they had a short court-martial, like an hour, and they were then hanged from trees. And then they marched, and he took away their bayonets, and he took away their ammunition. And the British were laughing. It's like, oh, they're coming down. They won't even. They're afraid to even let them have bayonets. They're afraid to let them load their guns because they're afraid of their own troops. The final mutiny was actually took place in Newburgh, and is the quite well-known Newburgh Conspiracy, which happened in 1783. And this time it was not the troops, but the officers who mutinied or came close to mutiny. The officers had been promised in the heat of the moment when the cause was teetering one way or the other, the officers had been promised half pay for life. That was a standard pension that officers got in the British Army. When you're done with active duty, you got half the pay for the rest of your life. And that was agreed on by the government. But as the war was winding down, they could see the government was backing away from that promise. So they said, well, okay, just make it 5 years full pay. And that'll give us a bonus for everything that we missed when we were away from our homes, our businesses, for 8 years. So the government was sort of wavering about that one. The government really had no power to do that. They didn't have the taxing power to say we can get together enough money to give these guys 5 years pay. And the officers realized that when the army was disbanded, as it was coming close to doing, they would have no more leverage. So they said, we have to move now before the army is disbanded. The war was almost over, the peace treaty was being negotiated, and they circulated some letters among the officers down in New Windsor. Maybe we should go down and take matters in our own hands, essentially proposing a military coup. So they were risking charge of treason against them versus the possibility of a military coup overthrowing the government in Philadelphia. At that point, Washington, who had found out about this whole thing, began his great theatrical performance of his life, and they were going to have a big meeting, and they had built a big hall, a meeting hall down there, and the officers were going to discuss the whole thing, and Washington was not expected to attend. And what he knew about the meeting, he burst into the meeting, strode up to the front, and he had an impassioned speech prepared, and he told them, do not ruin your reputation, which is this glorious reputation you built up by defeating the British in the war, is now going to be ruined if you go ahead with this plan. And when he got done with his speech, he looked out at the audience, and there were just angry faces looking back at him. So his speech hadn't been effective. But he had a plan B. So he was at the point in life where he needed reading glasses, and he recently got a pair of spectacles. But nobody except his close aides has seen him wear the spectacles. So he pulled out a letter from a member of Congress. He said, this letter seems to indicate that they might be willing to compromise. And he started to read it, and he stopped, and then he pulled the spectacles out. And he very slowly unfolded them, very slowly put them on. And he said, you'll have to excuse me, gentlemen. I've grown gray in your service, and now I find myself going blind. And of course, Washington had the great poker face, the great, and these officers who had seen a lot of mayhem during the course of the war, a lot of them burst into tears. And the whole thing dissolved. And he had Henry Knox ready to jump up and say, well, let's call off the coup and we'll all be loyal to the government. And they did get certificates for their pay. And some of them held out and got the pay. The certificates were paid off eventually, but other officers had to sell their certificates. And in the same deal, they promised to give the regular troops, the officers were concerned with their men, they hadn't gotten to know them very well. So the government said, we'll give them 3 months of their back pay before they're dismissed. Oh, then they said, no, let's make that 1 month. And then they said, no, we're not going to give them anything. They're just going to be dismissed. So the war is over. So after the war, the attitude of the public became worse towards the troops. There was, of course, the famous quote from the Thomas Paine wrote in 1776 at the worst, most precarious moment of the war. He said, these are the times that try men's souls. And he said, the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. And now that the war had been won, the summer soldiers and the sunshine patriots came out of the woodwork, and they said, we won the war, us patriots. It was a people's war, it was a people's victory. The militia was praised to the skies, and the 4th of July orators would come out. It was the people, the yeoman farmers, the citizen soldiers, and the distinction between professional, regular soldiers in the army and the civilians was muddied over. And the contribution to the regular army was downplayed. The mercenaries, the paid soldiers. And someone said, somehow there's a general disgust taking place for what bears the name of a regular. And a regular was, of course, was a Continental Army soldier. They were something that people wanted to forget about. And they entirely disbanded the Continental Army. There were only a few hundred soldiers were kept in the army at various posts out in the west and at the 2 armories that they established. So all that was left then was for the troops, was the pension that they might get. And there was, as there almost had to be, a pension voted for the troops that had been totally disabled in the war, who'd been wounded and had a leg taken off, whatever. So there was a disability pension that for officers was half pay for life, and for individual soldiers it was $5 a month. That was the only pensions that were given out immediately after the Revolutionary War. So the Continental Army soldiers went home and were forgotten. Time passed. We got to the War of 1812, which was a mixed blessing for America, but stirred up a lot of patriotism. And people began to say, oh, what about those Revolutionary War veterans? Whatever happened to them? And President Monroe, who was the last president who had been an active participant in the Revolutionary War and was actually wounded quite badly at the Battle of Trenton, encouraged Congress and finally got passed in 1818 the Revolutionary War Pension Act. And the pension would be paid if the person was in reduced circumstances, what they call reduced circumstances. And some people in the country didn't even want that. They said that's too generous to give them $8 a month if they're poverty stricken. This was 43 years after the war had begun. And it was never made clear, was this supposed to be an honor for the veterans of the war, or was this just a handout out of pity? And it was, I was sort of interested in it because I had an ancestor that fought in the Revolutionary War, that had enlisted at 14. And he was in 1821, when he applied for one of these pensions, he was 53 years old. He had some medical problems, I guess. And to get his pension, he had to list his assets. So he listed his assets, and these are handwritten affidavits that they had to make out for these special courts, and are now actually available online. And his assets were 3 chairs, 1 small pot, 2 teacups with saucers, 2 pigs, 5 sheep, 2 hens, and 1 old Bible. So he was poor enough, I guess he got his pension, but he had to be treated as a beggar in order to get it. So more time went by. In the 1830s, they finally decided to extend these pensions to all veterans of the Revolutionary War and their widows. Of course, by this time, the youngest of them were in their 60s and 70s. This is 57 years after the war had begun. And the one I liked the best was in 1864. Congress voted to give a $100 stipend to every Revolutionary War veteran. This was 92 years after the war began, and 5 years later, the last Revolutionary War veteran died, so they didn't have to worry about it anymore. And this was a problem that was it's not like a modern take on what happened back then. It was a problem that was recognized at the time. The suffering Revolutionary War soldier, the poor guy who had fought for his country and was being neglected, was a kind of proverbial character in those days, of the early republic. And there was a poet by the name of Philip Freneau, was regarded as the poet of the Revolution, who wrote a poem in 1809. He said, "Deep in a vale, a stranger now to arms, too poor to shine in courts, too proud to beg, he who once warred on Saratoga's plains sits musing over his scars and his wooden leg." So, I don't know what conclusion to draw from all this. The United States has always been somewhat ambiguous about the military. During the Revolution, the Army was really the heart of the country, and Henry Knox used to offer a toast to the Army and call it the hoop to the barrel. It was the organization in the country that held everything together during the war. But afterwards it was distrusted. Standing Army was probably quite wisely distrusted. They'd suffered from standing armies. They insisted on subservience of the military to the civil authority. One of the great contributions that George Washington made, and perhaps his greatest contribution, was that he also insisted that the military would be entirely subservient to the civil authority. They would never make decisions on their own. They would just do what they were told by the civilians. It's something we take for granted, of course, in this country now, and for all the history of the country, but if you look around the world, and you can see that it's not always the case. They distrusted an elite class of retired officers being supported by the government. Probably a good thing. But Joseph Plum Martin, in his summing up the whole experience in a nutshell, he said, when the country had drained the last drop of service it could screw out of the poor soldiers, they were turned adrift like old worn-out horses, and nothing said about land to pasture them upon. And I guess it's just I would say, you know, from my own point of view, that people like Joseph Plum Martin and Knox and Anthony Wayne and Nathaniel Greene and the others, they served in the Army, they persisted, they won the war, they suffered the neglect, they suffered the scorn of their fellow citizens to a certain extent. Many of them were in debt after the war, they were not paid, they were not properly supplied, but I think they've been honored by history in a way that the summer soldiers and the Sunshine Patriots were not honored and were largely forgotten. So that's my talk, and I'd like to answer any questions, or if anybody has any comments. You know, I've thought about this in terms of a lot of the books and movies and situations in the real world that are going on now regarding veterans and post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury, and are we really doing all we can for veterans now, both while they're soldiers and after they get out? So if anybody has any comments or questions, I'd love to answer them. Yes?
This is very fascinating because, well, it's fascinating, and it's interesting to me because my son just finished writing a thesis, his PhD thesis, on what happened to the Loyalists following the Revolution. And they really didn't have it so bad, especially compared to the veterans. There's a huge difference in the way that, in their standard of living, for example.
Of the Loyalists.
Yeah.
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 Well, you know,
They were pretty well off.
part of it, I think, was a lot of the Loyalists tended to have more money.
Yeah.
And
People with
so
money.
there was a lot of class deference then that overrode the political, you know, it's, if you were poor and on our side, but this other guy is rich, and on the side of, on the other side, well, you know, I can identify with him more than I can with that poor guy, so I think that's a...
Right. And many had the means to leave, and they did.
Yeah. Yes.
How many soldiers were in the Continental Army?
Total is, I think there was maybe 100,000 total, but that's over the war. At any given time, the Army was usually between 10 to 20,000 maybe. But, you know, over the course of the war, maybe 100,000 went through. It was not, you know, it was a very small scale compared to what came later. Even the Civil War was huge compared to the Revolutionary War. So it was a pretty small minority.
How do you describe this? It's amazing to me that we won the war. Because the British were they were so organized, and they had money, and they had, you know, an army, and we had the militia just sort of came together, and then all of a sudden we had to go to war, and we didn't have anything in place. We didn't really even have a government, did we?
All right. Well, the Congress was meeting at the time. The Second Continental Congress was in session at the time that the Battle of Lexington broke out. So that was a very much an ad hoc representatives from all the 13 colonies, and the colonies were very much more diverse and separate then, because, like I was saying about Washington coming up to Boston, it was like going to another country, a foreign country, because he'd only been to Boston once before in his life, and the people there, they were different religion, they were different, they spoke in a different way, and he would have had nothing to do with them at all. His relations were with Europe and Britain. You know, he would sell his products there, back and forth. Everything was faced back towards Europe. So it was amazing. It was, and Washington, there was a quote that Washington had, it was nothing short of a miracle. And that's essentially what it was in a lot of ways. I mean, there were factors, of course. The French came in, the French helped supply the Americans and also broaden the war out, distract the British from focusing entirely on the 13 colonies. but it was certainly an amazing achievement.
So I had a question about the taxation, because they weren't allowed to tax, you said there was no taxing system or anything like that. So how did they run anything? How, when there were public needs, roads or the mail or anything that was a public service, if they had nothing in place, then they never even thought about how they were gonna pay for the army, or they never even considered that they would, it seems like. And if they had nothing in place, how did they run anything?
The Postal Service, I think they took over the Postal Service. It was already established by the British. Everything else was, was the Articles of Confederation were the ruling document, and it was a very weak, loose confederation. Everything had to be approved by all the colonies. I think it was like it had to be unanimous for most things. Every colony had a vote in favor of it. It was so unworkable, and particularly the officers in the army who were the first ones to say, this is not going to work. And they became, if you follow a little bit farther down the road, Alexander Hamilton, Washington, they became the Federalists, and they became the ones that pushed for a stronger central government. And there was then this other side, and it was the big split in thought that goes on today in this country, of the Jefferson crowd who said, no, there should be, the state should have the main authority. And we don't need a federal government, that's become a tyranny. And that back and forth has been going on ever since. But under the Constitution, they set up a much stronger government. That was later.
The states did have the power to tax citizens.
Yes.
For roads, for
Well,
whatever, or?
Roads were even more local. Most roads were like a township would keep a road
Right.
up, and the farmers sometimes they would require the farmers to devote 2 days a year or something to working on the roads. But the roads were terrible. I mean, they really were bad.
But when the states when the militias became militias within the states, were they paid at all, or were they strictly volunteer, or did the state pay? I mean,
They
to
were
equip
paid,
them,
they were paid, and some of them were paid more. That was another problem that developed as the war went on. There were quotas made up. The state would have they had to have their own militia, and they had to supply a certain number of troops for the Continental Army. They would pay the militia better than what was being offered for the Continental Army, so it was hard to attract guys to join up when they could get a bigger bonus or more money by joining the militia.
wow.
So it was, there's conflicts in every direction. And the militia did, and Joseph Plum Martin in his book has to defend the Continental Army. He said everybody says the militia were the ones that won the war, but he said some of them fought very well, which was true. I mean, Bunker Hill was all fought by militia, and that there was cases, but there were a lot of cases where they just didn't have the discipline to stand up to a battle, and they ran. As soon as the battle started, they just ran away, and I don't blame them. You had to be hardened, and it took time to train the troops. And in the Continental Army, they did. In the militia, they would, had started out just one day a month, maybe they'd drill. So they were of limited effectiveness throughout the whole war. But if you ever think about it, how do you, when I think about the way I thought about the war before I started doing this research, it was, the Americans they'd come out and they were citizen soldiers, and they hid behind trees and they popped off at the British. That mythology developed immediately. It was even during the war, and particularly after the war, the militia had done a lot of the fighting, a lot of the credit went to the militia. So it allowed everybody to share. Oh, I was in the militia, I went up there. I was a participant in the victory. So, yes.
So did you end up feeling or having a different idea from when you started thinking about writing the book? Like you had a point of view or you had a curiosity or you had a position maybe, and then did you have a different one?
Yeah, I think, I tended to veer more towards that idea of, I was kind of a Jeffersonian inclined before, and I ended up being more inclined towards the Federalist point of view. I think they did need it. I think it was obvious, because it was so obvious in the Army that you needed a federal government with tax power to collect the taxes and then to have an efficient supply system supply the Army. Well, that was true of other things in society as well, but it was so blatant in the Army that they were the first ones that really saw it and saw that something had to be done. And so I think they were right. And I think that Jefferson had a more romantic view of society that was really backward looking.
Well, he wasn't in the army, though, right? He never fought in the
No.
army.
He ran away. He was governor of Virginia, right?
Well, he had a very undistinguished time as governor of Virginia, and when they attacked in Virginia, Cornwallis came up there. Tarleton, the great cavalry villain of the British Army, who had committed various atrocities, they ran out to where Monticello's out in Charlottesville, and they went out there and they came very close to catching him. He ran out the back door as they were coming in the front door. And he had not really prepared the state, he hadn't organized to repel, so when the British got there, they ran all over Virginia just at will until first Lafayette and then those troops I was talking about that Anthony Wayne brought down, that they had mutinied and they had to hang them, a bunch of them, they had to march without the bayonets. They were going to Virginia to try to shore up, and then I think there was only a 1-year term or something for governor, and so the next year Jefferson decided not to run, and they got
He
another
wanted to
guy.
spend more time with his family.
Yeah,
So was there a standing army at all afterwards, or did they just send everybody?
virtually no.
And when did they start having a standing army?
Well, then when the War of 1812 came along, they also call up the militia,
No, I see.
but they began again then to see, because we did very badly in the War of 1812. But a lot of that was fought with militia. It was Jackson's, the one victory, we had two big victories that are reasonable victories, which was New Orleans and the Battle of Plattsburgh. And both of them were militia, basically militia units. So Jackson had gathered the militia and taken down there. So I think that as far as when they began to build up a regular army, I think even when the Civil War broke out, the Union Army was pretty small. But by then they had West Point, they had an
When did they
officer corps.
establish West Point?
That was
gonna ask.
1802. That was an idea that Henry Knox had during the Revolutionary War, and he wasn't able to. He had schools to train officers, and particularly for artillery, and they weren't able to make them permanent. Even though he and Washington all said, "Let's keep these schools going." After the peace, they said no, and even though Knox became the Secretary of War under Washington's administration, he still couldn't get it through. But then finally, it finally passed. It was established in 1802 under Jefferson. So, and it's been there, it's, I guess, the oldest permanent base. And they had the two arsenals, one up in Springfield and one was in Harper's Ferry, that they manned those just guard the weapons. But not much.
But they did. Washington led the army to put down Shays' Rebellion, which was early in the
You're thinking of the Whiskey Rebellion.
Whiskey Rebellion.
Yeah, out in Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
but that was not, I guess there was federal troops in that.
I think there was.
Shays's Rebellion was in western Massachusetts.
Right.
Ironically, I was gonna mention Shays's Rebellion because even though it wasn't a direct outcome of the Revolutionary War, a lot of the guys who were in it had been soldiers in the Revolution. They went back to try to farm, and they'd fallen into debt, and they didn't like the way, they were getting screwed financially, so they took up arms. But I think it was the Massachusetts militia that actually put that down. Revolutionary War veterans who signed up with the militia to fight because they needed the money, fighting against these other guys who also needed the money, who also had been in there.
Right.
And the next time it happened was in 1932, which was also somewhat related to this. After World War I, they promised a bonus. Same thing. Your bonus, when's it gonna get? 1945, 25 years later. And so when the Depression came, the veterans of World War I marched on Washington, set up a Hooverville, what they called Hooverville, was a shanty town in Washington, and the American Army, Hoover, didn't think the police could handle it, so he called out the Army. MacArthur, bayonets, tear gas, and they went in there and broke their heads and got rid of them. So, it goes on and on. Any other questions, comments, or? Well, I want to thank everybody for coming out today.